now. And this afternoon, we're hearing from Katherine Jones at the Kansas State University Polytechnic campus. Today, she's going to talk to us about Click to Interact. Take it away.
All right, so I am briefly going to show my face so that you know who I am, but I'm going to turn off my video for the rest of the presentation. And my excuse is that I want to save your bandwidth, but I'll be honest with you, I don't often have the opportunity to give presentations with notes because I usually present face-to-face and I think it's kind of tacky, but this is my chance. So I'm using notes and I don't want you to just have to stare at the top of my head as I read them. All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Click to Interact, a presentation about educating in libraries using point-and-click games as a framework. This presentation is going to be totally tongue-in-cheek, and it is not meant to be a definitive resource on library instruction. Really, my hope is just that you're going to leave this session with a new perspective on educating patrons and maybe also learn something about playing adventure puzzle games. Let's go ahead and get started. Well, who am I? Introductions are super important, especially when we're talking about point and click games. The best and most enduring point and click games have vibrant and often humorous protagonists. Sadly, I haven't been scripted by George Lucas, so I can't promise nearly as many cutting one-liners. What I can provide, though, is some context. Who I am and why am I presenting this content? Well, first of all, my official title is I'm the Undergraduate Services Librarian at Polytechnic. My shtick is helping students with research for their papers and projects, but I also work for a relatively small campus that completely restructures itself every single semester. So I've worn the hat of a remedial English professor, the tutoring program supervisor, and I'm also currently our temporary director. In a job like mine, flexibility and out-of-the-box thinking is required to stay effective and to stay sane. And I think that correlates to the point-and-click genre of gaming pretty nicely, actually. So first, I want to get to know a little bit about you and where you are as an audience when relating to this topic. So I'm going to have you please access this poll. And I meant to have it copy-pasted to throw into the chat, and I don't think I did. So I'll do that real quick. If that makes it easier for you to find anything. All right, so I'm going to have you navigate to this Poll Everywhere link, if you would please, and answer the question, how much do you know about point and click games? And I'll give you just a few seconds to answer the question. Somebody's responded already. That's excellent. A little bit is pretty good. Well, either everybody's really shy or you're having trouble with the poll. Either one is possible. There we go. No worries. You guys are doing great. Give just a couple more seconds here. Angie, the link to the poll is in the chat and you should be able to access it just fine. It's still open. Okay, it's like the majority is a little bit. I'm pretty excited about the percentage that knows a good deal. I kind of thought I'd be the only one in the room. Fantastic. Okay, so we're in like a middling range of knowledge in terms of coming to this with any knowledge about the genre, which is great. I think we can address that pretty well in this presentation. All right, so I'm going to get back into the PowerPoint. Thank you so much for answering my poll. All right, so if we have like a middling range of knowledge or even some folks who are not remotely familiar, I obviously need the question of what even is point and click. It would tickle me pink if everybody in this audience was familiar with point and click and gaming in general, but I understand that's not the case, so I'm going to provide a little bit of background information. Point and click is a style of gaming that started gaining traction in the 1980s, and for the most part, while this genre does endure, it's mostly because of nostalgic game developers and nostalgic players like me. It had its heyday in the era of low graphics and heavy story-based gaming, and that day has mostly passed in mainstream gaming circles. I digress, though. Basically, what you need to know is these games spun off of text-based interaction interactive fiction games. And they're the ones that had paragraphs and paragraphs of text that was descriptive, and you would have to type things like go west or pick up stick to interact with that imaginary world. Point and click follows a similar structure to those interactive fiction games, but with the addition of a visual graphic interface and often a much more cohesive and linear narrative structure. You use your cursor to point and click and interact with those visual elements. Actions such as look, talk, use, etc. are available, and these games are largely about exploration and putting together metaphorical puzzle pieces in order to advance to the next scene. So as we can see in this GIF, this is an image from the game Monkey Island, and our protagonist Guybrush Threepwood here is trying to get this fish. And the bird is in his way. So he's stepping on its plank in order to throw the bird up into the air and then going and picking up the fish, which he will later use to solve a puzzle. Because that's what you do with fish. Point and click gameplay. So the gameplay of classic point and click is puzzle focused, narratively dense. There's a lot of reading required typically, and it's semi-linear, and we'll get into that later. It's best done also by cheating as much as humanly possible, but that might just be me. I love a good spoiler-free walkthrough. Puzzles are really hard. So in order to really give you an idea of what we're talking about here, I'd like to present a brief demo of a newer point and click game from 2013. And while I'll play the video, I'm also going to point out a few key features to give you an idea of what we're talking about. So her objective is to get this stick out of the cage.
By the gleam in his eyes, I can tell he's probably yelling his head off.
He is sentient, so he's kind of mad right now. She's going to pick up this vine. And her objective is to open the cage door because she has no key.
It's firmly locked.
Point and click is often about picking up whatever objects are not nailed down to the floor, which you can see she's engaging in pretty intensely. The players got it figured out that the easiest way to open the door would be with some kind of leverage.
One end to the weapons rack.
So she's attaching the weapons rack to the door.
And I'll fasten the other end to the cabinet. It's not intended to fit, but it works.
So she's just combined two elements together, two different weapons.
But perhaps I can use it to reach places that were inaccessible before.
And she's done it 3 times now to make basically a really long stick. Again, picking up things that are not nailed down. The intention being that the weapons rack isn't heavy enough to do any good yet.
It's heavier than it looks.
She's building herself a bridge to get over this hole.
I'll swap the weapons.
She's swapping the weapons out because she needs some way to break the glass. And the weapon that's in her hand now is better for that job. It's a mace. It's much heavier than a halberd.
I'll take the thing apart first.
Okay, so she's collected every weapon in the room. And now she's going to dismantle her bridge and pull all of these various pieces of very heavy weaponry into this weapons rack. which is really unfortunate because, spoiler alert, in the next scene, she has to fight the bad guy and she has no weapons at all because she used them to open this cage. Big bummer. It's a very brains over brawn approach to gaming. She closes the weapon rack. She's going to push it over the edge.
But where?
And you'll notice how the dialogue kind of prompts the player to know what to do next. And she saved the staff. Hooray! Pretty long, complicated process just to open a door, but that's the way it is. Okay, so now at this point, you have some foundational information, but I'm pretty sure that the majority is wondering, what even is this presentation? To which I say, oh, look behind you, there's a three-headed monkey. Did that work? No? Okay, well, I tried. All right, more seriously, I've been poking around the fringes of gamification and critical thinking in library instruction pretty much since I first became a professional librarian. When I first began exploring the topic as a grad student, I, like many others, fell into the enticing topic of gamification in education. That is, how to use games in the learning environment to make the absorption of information more entertaining for students and patrons. Over time, though, I realized that a board game about using the databases is still about databases. Slathering a layer of frosting on a brick doesn't make the brick itself edible. Now, personally, I think bricks are awesome. They're very useful, but a lot of the students that I engage with don't really appreciate bricks the way that I do. If anything, gamifying education can sometimes make the learning process even more confusing for the audience if they happen to get lost in the weeds of the game's mechanics and rewards and forget that the objective all along was to learn about the library and to learn about information literacy. So in recent years, I've started to move away from playing games in the classroom to structuring education in a way that has the same engaging properties as a really good game. It's a slight but vital difference in one's approach to gamification in education. Structuring education like an interesting puzzle is always in the back of my professional brain. When quarantine hit, my non-professional brain was hit with about 1,000 tons of existential angst. While I was lucky enough to be afforded the opportunity to work from home from March through August, all of those hours of nervously doom scrolling through COVID-19 case stats and wondering what on earth my university was going to do come fall, it had me feeling really unmoored, like I was living in a world of pure uncertainty. And I'm pretty sure a lot of you felt the same way, and you had your own ways of coping. My way of coping was playing lots and lots of point-and-click games. Immersing myself in the game's narratives and working my way from puzzle to puzzle gave me structure and definite objectives that real life couldn't offer at the time. And so while I was running around in pixel graphic landscapes, picking up everything that wasn't nailed down and triggering all the possible dialogue options with every non-playable character I met, I realized something, that there's actually a lot to be learned from this style of game. Today, I'm going to present two different concepts. The first is, what can point-and-click games teach us in a general sense about educating patrons? And then the second, what can we learn from the pitfalls and problems that point-and-click games have from a structural and presentational sense? So let's start with the more existential issues. Abstract concepts that I can learn from point-and-click. Number one, stuff your inventory. Point-and-click games almost always have an inventory-based structure where you collect items from locations and then later use them to solve puzzles and address problems. On the left-hand side here is the inventory screen from a game called Deponia. You can see that it's pretty eclectic. I've often found that the most effective educators in my life knew a lot of stuff. That stuff wasn't always directly related to their specialization. My most valued professors had a wide scope of knowledge in a lot of different areas, and they delighted in drawing those topics into their classes in interesting and innovative ways, the better to assist students in remembering the content for the long haul. Of course, most educators that I've known are also eager learners themselves, so it's kind of rare that any of us would forego an opportunity to expand our knowledge, especially if we could do it for free. On the right-hand side, you can see just a few of the many options for online continuing education out there. Not all of them are free, I have to admit, but those that cost money are usually worth the price. For myself, I've just learned a lot from YouTube tutorials provided from all kinds of educational bodies and experts, and I highly recommend checking out any of these listed venues to help stuff your inventory with all kinds of useful items. Combining unliked things. Oftentimes, a point-and-click game will require the player to think really outside the box. Personally, that's when I throw up my hands in defeat and go dig up the help guide, but we'll get to that one in a second. The most culturally enduring example of this is The Secret of Monkey Island's infamous rubber chicken with a pulley in the middle. A strange combo of items indeed. The most important thing about the pulley rubber chicken is that it seems extraordinarily useless, but it's used in the game for multiple tasks to great effect. You never know what strange thing will become vital to your endeavors later on. In librarianship, combining unlike things usually involves an equation like library plus blank equals education. Libraries have leaned into this out of the box thinking with escape rooms, indoor mini golf, research games, memes and jokes in instructional sessions, and heaps more stuff. I would almost argue that nearly everything we do in a modern library is similar to the pulley rubber chicken, as we strive as a profession to push the boundaries and prove that libraries can grow and adapt to stay relevant and accessible. Number 3 is exhaust all the dialogue options. On the left-hand side, you can see a screenshot from a dialogue tree in the game Grim Fandango. Dialogue options in these kinds of games rarely make or break the game. For the most part, it's just a good way to pull as much information from the non-playable characters around you as possible to help solve puzzles and address various tasks. In some games, though, being careless with your dialogue options can throw a wrench in the works for your progress. In Monkey Island, the developers went a step further, and they made witty back and forth a style of sword play. Regardless of exactly how it's used in-game, point-and-click games understand that communication is vitally important. Of course, we as librarians also recognize that importance, and we know that communicating effectively with patrons isn't always the easiest thing to do. Reference interviews can get tangled. In-class instructions peter out completely without an active audience. So it's helpful to create as many points of contact as possible between yourself and your patrons or students. Consider embedding real-time polling or chat options in your live instruction sessions. And when you're not engaging directly and actively with patron learners, build robust feedback options into your passive interfaces, such as your website or subject guides, to encourage patrons to reach out. At my institution, students are absolutely abysmal at responding to their emails. The best way to contact our students is through their teaching faculty, or, as amusing as it may seem, the coordinator of our student gym. Nothing works quite as well as accosting a student with information while they're trapped in the classroom or occupied with lifting weights. For those of you that are outside of the academic sphere, think of your contact points in a similar way. Do you have community entities that you can collaborate on a regular basis who might be better able to make personal contact with your learning audience? If so, make use of them. The best promotion is always word of mouth, and that remains as true in libraries as it does anywhere else. Number 4 is my favorite. When in doubt, get help. On the left-hand side, we see here a joke scene from the game Monkey Island. So if you sit around for 10 minutes and allow the protagonist, who is currently underwater in the scene, to drown, this new option pops up to order hint book because you're obviously not doing very well playing the game. Now, nobody orders paper hint books anymore. That's what online walkthroughs are for. But the point does remain. Sometimes, rather than seek assistance, sorry, got a little bit distracted by somebody outside my door. Plowing onward. Sometimes, rather than beat your head against the wall on a puzzle that doesn't make sense, it's best to seek assistance from somewhere else. In librarianship, we are beyond lucky to have a largely friendly and accessible community of fellow professionals to rely on. If you have not already, please explore your options in the form of email listservs, social media groups, and blogs. On the right-hand side here, I provided a few examples. While I know many of us groan at the sheer number of emails that we can amass in a day thanks to CanLib, it's still one of the best resources I've ever found to quickly get in contact with a large number of Kansas librarians as soon as possible. Facebook groups are typically more informal, but that kind of environment can be useful if you need a private group to vent to or a public group that can help you spread the word across an international sphere. Blogs from fellow librarians are great because the more robust of them have large archives of posts that go way back, the better to track the progression of librarianship as a field from the past until now. These arenas are great for answering specific questions that you may have about strange problems, as well as gathering more general information about your job. So for me, in my position, I wear a lot of different hats, and I just need a lot of help, usually from people who have done my job before or who know a lot about the particular protocols and progresses that I don't. Seeking help from others gets you a long way in the progress of your game and also in life. Okay, so those are kind of the existential things that I learned from point and click, which I think are helpful just in living my professional and personal life in general. But there are a few things that I've pulled specifically from game developers in this genre that I think really say a lot about how we can build our instructional environment and our resources. And that's what we're going to get into now. It's time to get into the nitty-gritty of library education. So for this section, we're relying on the words of Ron Gilbert. He's the creator of the Monkey Island series of point-and-click games that I've mentioned a few times now. And in 1989, he released a sarcastic article called "Why Adventure Games Suck," outlining all of the errors that game developers make when creating games in the genre. I've gone through the article, and I pulled from it a few key pieces that I feel apply pretty well to library instruction. Remember, my focus with this presentation is not how to gamify the library, but instead, what can we learn from the structure and implementation of games to help make our instruction more engaging and impactful for our learners. Rule number 1, end objectives need to be clear. Nothing is more frustrating than wandering around, wondering what you should be doing, and if what you've been doing is going to get you anywhere. Experience has taught me that students work through instructional sessions with fewer complaints when they know exactly what's going to be covered and how long it's going to take. Providing a quick lesson agenda at the beginning of a live session or even a pre-recorded tutorial video can go a long way. Rule number 2, sub-goals need to be obvious. This is just good storytelling. Ben Kenobi pretty much laid out Luke's whole journey in the first 20 minutes of Star Wars. This has provided a way for the audience to follow the progression of the main character. It's very easy when designing to become blind to what the player doesn't know about your story. Okay, so in an educational environment, we aren't exactly worrying about narrative structure, but we should, however, have an awareness of what our audience doesn't know, and more importantly, what they don't know they don't know. Tailoring educational content to the knowledge gaps of one's audience prevents frustration on the part of the learner, and it provides a solid guide map for stronger lesson planning in the future. Rule number 3, puzzles should advance the story. Each puzzle solved should bring the player closer to understanding the story and the game. It should be somewhat clear how solving this puzzle brings the player closer to the immediate goal. So many elements of high quality research are a type of critical thinking puzzle. I think most of us know that. Coming up with the most effective keywords without a lot of useless scrambling, filtering down to relevant results, only to prevent hours of needless scrolling. So many tiny puzzles have to be solved to ensure a faster, more efficient research process. Explaining these pieces of the research process to students in a way that helps them see how each step fits into the bigger picture can be really difficult, especially when they are so convinced that using online search engines or databases such as Google is just inherently faster and easier because they don't see those tiny puzzles of keyword development, filter application, etc. in action there. Presenting those pieces as skills that are meant to prevent frustration in the future helps bring the learner closer to their ultimate goal of finding resources to use. And of course, this perspective applies to any type of library-centric education that you provide to your audience. The one that I gave is just an example of what I've experienced with my students. Rule number 4, real-time is bad drama, so slow down. Give the player some slack when doing time-based puzzles. Try to watch for intent. If the player is working towards the solution and almost ready to complete it, wait. It's really hard to cram everything that we need to impart in these tiny 15, 30, or even 50-minute educational sessions. It's even harder to cram it into 2, 5, or 10-minute tutorial videos. Even so, it's important to keep the self-directed elements of the learning process in mind when developing educational lessons and resources. Learners need time to sit on the information and apply it directly to a task in order to retain what's taught. Slow down whenever possible and give learners time. I definitely struggle with this because I talk really fast, especially when I'm nervous, which I almost always am if I'm standing in front of anybody giving any kind of lecture. So what I've done to make this possible for myself is build in places in my lesson plan where we take a little break. whether it be a working activity for the students where they can kind of focus on applying whatever skill we've just taught, or just a little moment to do a poll. In COVID times, since I can't really talk to them face to face, if I was in the classroom, it might just be a moment to ask a question and get a few answers. Build in that time if you're not the kind of person who can kind of naturally lean into the silence. Rule number 5, incremental reward. The player needs to know that she's achieving. The fastest way to turn a player off is to let the game drag on with no advancement. One of the most fascinating things for me to learn about games and engagement is that the trick to engagement, or in many places addiction, is to provide external motivators. This is why grinding in games, that is, doing a task over and over for a long period of time to earn small items and rewards, is such a popular form of gameplay. It keeps players stuck in the game, doing a lot of work for a periodic award, one that would usually lead to something larger and more impactful once they've gathered enough of that small item. From a gamer psychology standpoint, knowing this is kind of terrifying, but there is something useful to be learned from this, which is that human beings are obsessed with external motivation, especially in the form of tangible rewards that come at regular intervals during short spans of time. So we can hack into that gamer's mindset easily by providing incremental rewards throughout a teaching session. Mostly, I'm kind of boring, so I just provide this in the form of verbal encouragement, like, yes, you're great, that's a perfect answer, or you're doing so well. And if not verbal encouragement, then I usually give away treats like small candy bars or little trinkets that you can buy at the dollar store. But depending on your audience and the structure of your instruction, you may have the opportunity to provide much more interesting rewards to your learners. As long as it's positive and provided often, the player, or in our case, the learner, will get something out of it. Number 6, avoid arbitrary puzzles. Puzzles and their solutions need to make sense. They don't have to be obvious, they just have to make sense. The best reaction after solving a tough puzzle should be, of course, why didn't I think of that sooner? The worst and most often heard after being told the solution is, I never would have gotten that. If the solution can only be reached by trial and error or plain luck, it's a bad puzzle. Unfortunately, I hear both of the phrases quoted here quite a lot, especially after working one-on-one with a student to find resources that relates to their paper or project topic. One of the things that helps set students up for the why didn't I think of that sooner mindset over the I never would have thought of that mindset is spending a few minutes with each one in a one-on-one session, quizzing them about the basics of the research process. So that's something that I can do because I teach for a very small campus, and I have a lot of face time with my students just naturally. I'm embedded into a lot of general education courses, and I get to know them pretty well. If you are a larger institution, you may not have those opportunities in terms of having face-to-face conversations, but I'm sure that you are creative enough that you can think of different ways to engage with students on a slightly more personal level to really see where they are. A brief refresher of information can go a long way to reminding students that the puzzle pieces that they've already learned about, like keywords, filters, etc., actually do have a purpose. And this makes the puzzle of the research process feel less arbitrary to the student's perspective, preventing some unneeded frustration. It's also useful, as pictured here, to remind students that researching and other activities related to the library are nothing more than an exercise in basic critical thinking. Presenting these aspects of information literacy and library use as a puzzle that can be solved helps students' mindsets and makes for more healthy and happier student and interstructure interactions. Oftentimes, the easiest thing that you can do, especially in an instruction session that doesn't seem to be going well, is to step back and acknowledge the fact that it's not as difficult as it sounds, especially when we kind of get lost in the jargon and we kind of tend to hyper focus on the small details of research that we know a lot about, because a lot of us have been trained in that area, that the students don't have as much experience with. Because a lot of my students, especially, it may be the first time that they've ever done collegiate research, and it may also be the last time that they're ever asked to do collegiate research, because we are a very industry-focused campus, and they kind of go in a different direction when they talk about research in those spheres. So that little bit of buildup, that little bit of a reminder that this is a basic skill that you have to learn. And once you learn it, it applies no matter what assignment you're working on. That can really go a long way, and it makes the puzzle feel more important. Rule number 7, give the players options. A lot of story games employ a technique that can best be described as caging the player. This occurs when the player is required to solve a small set of puzzles in order to advance to the next section of the game, at which point she is presented with another small set of puzzles. Once those puzzles are solved, in a seemingly endless series of cages, the player enters the next section. This can be particularly frustrating if the player is unable to solve a particular puzzle. So this one is a little bit more abstract. So I'm going to provide quite a bit of context to kind of explain where I'm coming from with this in terms of how it relates to instruction. One of my biggest frustrations as a library educator, and one of my biggest frustrations for my students also, is related to how we cage students in whenever we talk about academic researching. A huge percentage of my freshman students come in having they've been beaten over the head in high school about how the evils of Wikipedia and Google are prevalent and how they should never, ever use those resources for educational research. And this is frankly ridiculous and painfully limiting for my students, especially as many university faculty that I work with are also convinced that college students should only ever work in the library databases to find credible information with no other resources. And the way that this causes problems, I'll provide you with an example. I recently, just this semester, had some students in an introductory management class who came to me, eyes totally glazed and grinding their teeth in frustration because they'd been told in this management class to use the library databases to find resources about the future of management. So dutifully, because they've worked with me before. Introductory management is an introductory business class, but it's not a gen ed. So most of them have been in a few classes with me before. They knew the general gist. So they went to the general databases that I teach to freshman students, which are basically our databases that provide a wide scope covering tons of different topics. And I always recommend that as the best place to start because there's just so much stuff. And so it's very difficult for them to find themselves with too few options or no relevant options at all. It's a really good basic level way to get them in. So I teach these general databases to freshman students, and they had known this. And so they went in there and they typed in the search term, future and management, because that's what they've been asked to look for, the future of management. Well, as you can probably imagine, if you've worked with databases before, their results were absolutely worthless. Even applying filters, which they'd also been taught to do, such as publication date, source type, etc., all those things that I've discussed with them in my basic sessions about databases, it did nothing to improve the relevancy of their results. Now, you're information professionals, so you probably see what the issue is, but my students didn't understand. They didn't understand that future and management is a broad search term with no real direction. And that's why they felt so lost while scrolling through all the thousands and thousands of results that were coming up. But if they had gone to Google first and typed in future and management, do you know what they would have gotten immediately? A tiny numbered list of how business management will change in the next decade. And in that BuzzFeed style listicle, they would find keywords like lattice organization and holacracy, a fancy word for a self-directed team-based learning hierarchy, which if you're like me, you maybe didn't know, and the student didn't either. But guess what happens when you take these specific targeted keywords like holacracy and put them into the library database? Yeah, you get relevant, useful resources instead of pages and pages of informational garbage. Well, you may say, that's just developing keywords. Students should have known how to do that already. Well, they were taught that, I promise. We absolutely talked about how you need to use synonyms and related phrases sometimes to better speak to the database's algorithms. But these freshman students, they're not business majors. They're future plane pilots, because that's mostly what my institution teaches. They teach aviation and engineering and tech and industry heavy fields of study. Very few of them are taking intensive business courses. So they're future plane pilots taking introductory business management class for the very first time. It's only the first couple weeks of the semester. So they lack contextual, foundational knowledge to know what synonyms or related phrases to use. And by being told to avoid Wikipedia and Google like the plague, they have no means with which to quickly and effectively educate themselves on the jargon that's used in this completely alien to them field. So, getting back to the point, give your students options and avoid buying into intellectual elitism as much as possible. It's better to focus on evaluation schemas and broader information literacy skills used to ferret out the more credible resources than it is to blanket cut entire chunks of accessible information right out of the picture. Again, this is an example that's very specific to the realm of academic library instruction, and it focuses on research and higher education. But I believe that the lesson in here can apply to any area of instruction. There's almost always multiple ways to solve a puzzle, and learners have to be given free rein to work outside of the cages. Okay, poll number 2, those are all of my rules. And now at this point, I would like to know what elements of this presentation would you like to discuss more? So the poll link is the same. I'm going to, I'll access the chat and repost that for those of you that may have missed it. And if you'll give me just a second, I do need to activate that poll. Poll Everywhere is a little stingy with its polls. Okay, so the question is, which element of this presentation would you like to discuss more? And I'm presenting this to you because I want to steer a little bit where questions are coming from, and we can hit as many of these as we have time for. Which we actually have a little more time than I expected. I know I mentioned before that I talk fast, which is very true, but also I can fill time like you would not believe. So one of my biggest struggles as an instructor is typically to keep within the 10, 30, 50 minutes that I'm allotted. So I'm glad we have a little bit of time to talk here today. Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of results for stuff your inventory. And also sub goals need to be obvious. So let's start with stuff your inventory. And I'm going to go back to the presentation and go back to that slide. And I'm going to do it the slow and annoying way. Okay. So I'm happy to talk about these things, but I also am sure that there are plenty of people attending today who know a lot about these things as well. So I encourage you, if you would like to unmute at this time and provide some information about some of the places that you go to stuff your inventory, that's great. If you have questions about stuffing your inventory, I or your peers in this room would be happy to answer those things as well. So I'll give you a little bit of time to think about it. I am quickly going to answer a question in the chat, which is, yes, these slides are available in the Google Shared Drive. So what more can I tell you about stuffing your inventory, or what more would you like to say about stuffing your inventory as a concept?
Okay, here's my question.
Mhm.
I have all of these different listservs and I get WebJunction and all of these. How do you not get overwhelmed with inventory to the point to where you can't access any of it because it's completely overwhelming you?
I think that's a really good question. And I will admit that I'm the kind of person where if a resource starts to bother me or annoy me with the number of notifications, I drop it. I don't have time for that. I think, though, that I'm just a very black and white thinker, and there are shades of gray possible in this situation. So one of the things that I would suggest is if you're getting a lot of emails, I don't know what kind of email clients folks tend to use now, but we have Outlook at our institution, and it's built in that you have the ability to filter certain email names. Gosh, I'm sure there's a name for those, but it's not in my brain. You can filter emails coming from certain people into folders, which would give you the opportunity to kind of look at those later. I also think it's really important to prioritize the kinds of information that you're looking for. So I think for a lot of us, the reason why we get overwhelmed, especially for me personally, because I do wear a lot of hats, I subscribe to a lot of different things and a lot of different kinds of information, but I don't need to have access to, for example, I'm the supervisor of the peer tutoring program, and I want to be engaged in student tutoring concepts as much as possible, but I don't need it every day all year long. There are certain times of the year where having access to that information is more useful to me than others, at which point I may consider maybe subscribing to something for a short period of time and then unsubscribing when it gets to be too much. And then just kind of putting it in my calendar like, hey, you should resub to this resource months later, to kind of remind myself, because I also don't have a working memory. So I think filters, whether those be technical or physical, where you just throw it out for a little bit and then come back to it later, that's a pretty important skill for this kind of management. What else? Does anybody have a quote unquote inventory item that you want to plug right now? I've found that that's very helpful at conferences, but it doesn't come up as often as it should. So if you want to throw links into the chat, or if you want to verbally share something right now, I think people would appreciate that. Nothing to share? Oh, that shocks me. Absolutely. Yeah. The Coles listserv is great. I'm going to assume that the majority of folks in this particular presentation are probably related to colleges and universities. It's a great place to be. I will kind of veer off a little bit. I'm not going to talk about any of these in depth because I don't actively use a lot of these. These are just things that I'm aware of or have used in the past. So if you have any specific questions about any of these, please let me know. So in the chat, I teach monthly technology classes, and other libraries can log in and broadcast and interact with them so that they don't have to develop classes themselves monthly. And I've done it for years. That sounds great. I'm sure that there are people that would like to know more about that. I know for me especially, I get a lot more tech questions than I ever could have imagined for someone who's a research librarian. Luckily, I gravitate towards that a little bit, but there are always new things that I could stand to learn and things that I could stand to brush up on so that I can answer the questions that students throw at me randomly as quickly and easily as possible. Okay. I guess I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next piece from the poll, which again, I can't remember because I don't have a memory. All right, so we've got a pretty clear tie here between when in doubt, get help, sub goals need to be obvious, and real time is bad drama. So I think I'm just going to go in order here. So when in doubt, get help. I have at one time or another been a part of or have engaged with everything on this list here. So CanLib is probably pretty recognizable to most of you. ALATT can get pretty overwhelming. It's an incredibly large Facebook group at this point, and it is a public group, which can be difficult depending on what's going on in there. But I've also found it to be a very helpful resource, if nothing else, because I sometimes feel very disconnected from librarianship as a field. And being able to tap into that and see what people are talking about in the current time is really helpful for me to stay on track with trends and things like that. Any questions or things that you want to share or anything that's related to this? So the link to those monthly technology classes has been added to the chat, and I encourage you to look into those if that's of interest. Okay, everyone's so shy, which I totally understand because I would be too if I wasn't in the presenter mode. Um, I will say I'm just kind of gonna rattle a little bit, just kind of based on assumptions that I have about folks. Um, I think a lot of us are familiar with listservs because that's what we are told to do when we get into librarianship. Um, quite frankly, when I started in the field of librarianship, I was very confused by people talking about listserv because it felt very antiquated, and it still feels a little bit antiquated to me. I think they're difficult to navigate. I think they are difficult to manage from a filtering perspective, but they're still a good information resource. But if you, like me, are kind of like, oh, I don't like the interface of a listserv and you want other areas to go into, I do think that social media groups are the way to go. They're a little bit more trendy. They're a little bit nicer to look at and work with. Um, and if you are not super familiar with these kinds of groups, it's super easy just to type in like library group Facebook, and a lot of really kind and generous librarians have already put together the listicles that tell you what the top 5 or top 10 are that you might want to look at. So that's something that's totally out there if it's something that you want to explore more in depth. Okay, I'm going to the next one. A little bit of time here. Yes. Okay. Sub goals should be obvious. All right. What are the questions or statements that folks would like to present about this? Okay, assuming there are none, I will just plod forward and provide the information I think you need. so um, it, I may be a little bit biased when it comes to this because when I started my library career, this was something that we worked at to ask students in the instructional classes that we provided. So we actually had a worksheet that specifically asked them, when it relates to researching as a process, what do you not know? Or actually, what do you know? What do you not know? And things that you don't know, which, as you can imagine, you don't get a lot of answers about this at first. But once they start doing the process, you get a lot because they realize, oh, the reason why I'm struggling with this is because I don't understand it. So we ask that in the capacity of what do you know about research, but it's also a question that I like to ask students when they're actually engaged in the process in a classroom, when they're talking about their topics. So I asked them, what do you know about your topic? Why did it interest you in the first place? What do you not know about your topic that you think you're going to need to learn in order to complete this assignment? And then as they move along, they encounter those things that they didn't know, which is always really good because I think everybody, especially my students, have a lot of internal biases. And they have a lot of cognitive biases about various things that they think they know about. And in the course of the research process, they learn about the things that they didn't actually know, and they learn about the things that they may have learned incorrectly, which is always beneficial in the long term. So when we talk about sub goals needing to be obvious, I basically want you to think of it in terms of, can I make it clear to the students that the reason why this is being presented is because everybody has knowledge gaps, and a college student is not intended to know everything when they arrive in a classroom. And this learning process can be broken down into smaller, more easily digestible chunks. So Mara has said that her favorite group on Facebook is Troublesome Catalogers and Magical Metadata Fairies. So many helpful librarians. When I was a solo librarian, I turned to them frequently for systems questions. I was actually also briefly part of that group. It doesn't relate to anything that I'm doing in my professional life anymore, unfortunately, but it is a really great group. They are very talkative, they are very knowledgeable, and it's just a good place to be. Okay. Very, very few moments left. So if you've got any questions at this point in general, let me know and navigate to that slide. General questions that you might have the next 2 minutes. I completely failed to share my email address on the presentation, which I shouldn't be surprised because I do that every year. But I'm going to throw my email address into the chat. If you have follow-up questions that come up, or if you just want to shoot the breeze about these kinds of concepts, or you just want to talk about point and click games, you are more than welcome to reach out to me. I'm very, very accessible by email. I love talking to my fellow professionals because I don't get to do it very much. I'm in such a small library. There's just one other librarian, and she's my boss, so we can't really just sit down and talk about games, I guess. And I also will share my video now that I'm not looking at notes.
I knew it was going to be an awesome session.
Aw, thank you.
At this point, I'm going to go ahead and hit stop on the recording.